Well, thank you, Helio, for the introduction. And good evening, everybody. It's really my pleasure to be here, and I would like to thank the organizer. So we have heard about meta-learning, but here we are interested in higher order decision, especially how do we choose between different decision strategies. So there is no slide on the stuff. So. Okay, so I'll go back. Okay, so I was saying we are interested in how do we choose between different decision strategies, especially how does the brain does that. So I studied this in mice, and I trained them in a task that admits several decision strategies for deciding when to leave a foraging site. So in this task, the mouse exploit a foraging site, and it receives sensory input in the form of rewarded and failed attempts. And because there is a site depletion after a state transition, the mouse has to decide when to leave the site based on the combination of these sensory inputs. And there are different ways to combine binary inputs that underlie different decision strategies. So, for example, we have an inference-based strategy that require integration of these failures toward the decision to leave and a reset upon reward delivery, because this really shows that the mouse understand that when there's a reward, the resource is still available. So the mouse understands the latent structure of the task. Instead, we have also another strategy, which is the stimulus bound, which here it's much more simple. It's just based on the value of the foraging site. And basically, the more reward the mouse receives, the longer it stays, and vice versa. So these two strategies has been defined in this publication, if you're interested. So I have transferred this task in a head-fixed configuration, so that I could perform a large-scale recording. So in this version, the mouse is on a treadmill, and it licks at the spout to receive reward, but it can also switch between the sides by running on the treadmill, and it activates this movement of the spout. And then we ask in this task, which decision variable do the mouse use? So to address this question, we use a logistic regression based using these two different decision variables. And what we found, so to predict, the time that the mouse leaves the site, and what we found is that the behavior is actually very heterogeneous. So some sessions, in some sessions, the mouse behavior is largely explained by the stimulus bound strategy, and in other sessions, on the right side of this graph, in pink, the behavior is largely explained by the inference-based strategies. And this heterogeneity is actually really interesting for us because it's raised a lot of questions about how these different decision strategies are implemented in the brain. So we might expect that in the brain we would find a representation of the decision strategy that is used by the mouse. But it could also be that the two different strategies are implemented in two different regions of the brain. Or why not, maybe the two different strategies are computed in parallel in the same region. So to address this question, I perform a large-scale recording using neuropixels in the frontal cortex of the mouse, and I targeted the secondary motor cortex, which is a premotor region that is known to be important for evidence accumulation and action selection. And right below this region, there is the orbitofrontal cortex, which has been recently put forward as an important region for the inference of hidden states, especially in this task. And because we have this long shank, we can also record simultaneously in the olfactory cortex, which here we just treat as control region because there is no explicit olfactory cues. So this is an example of hundreds of neurons that I've recorded in the premotor cortex M2. And for everyone, also I can align them to the important event in this task, which are the streams of reward and failures. And for every isolated neurons, like this one in black, we can reconstruct how it responds to the important event. And then we can do that for every neurons that we record simultaneously. And from this estimate of the population activity, we ask whether we can decode the decision variable that is used by the mouse in this session. So here again, I'm going to walk you through an example where in this session, the mouse was largely using the inference-based strategy. So on this graph, it would be a 0.91. And this inference-based strategies is embodied in this decision variable that I'm showing you an example here for a few bouts. So this solid line represents bouts of behavior, a sequence of leaks, and the dashed line is simply to indicate the moment when the mouse leaves the site and just run to reach the other one. So what you can appreciate here is that the decision variable is actually quite different on a bout-by-bout basis. And we like to recover this variability. And to do so, we use a simple method. It's actually a multivariate regression that just tries to find a set of weight to apply to every one of these neurons, so that when we take the weighted sum of this population activity that is shown here in black, we do a pretty good job actually at recovering the trajectory of this decision variable. Yeah, that's better. So here we estimate the so this method was cross-validated and regularized to avoid overfitting. And we estimated the goodness of fit using the deviance explained. It's just like an R square where 0 means worst decoding and 1 means best decoding. And in this particular example, the deviance explained was 0.77, so it's pretty good. It means that we can decode in this session the inference-based strategy that is used by the mouse. So naturally, then we ask, can we decode the counterfactual strategy? Which is this decision variable that could be used based on the sequence of action that the mouse takes, but is not. So in this case, it's the stimulus-bound strategy, here in blue. And we were surprised that we could actually do a fairly good job also at decoding this stimulus-bound strategy. So that's one example. Let me show you a different example of another mouse that instead of using the inference-based strategy was using the stimulus-bound strategy. Can we also recover from the premotor cortex of this mouse the decision variable? Well, it seems like yes, at least to the same extent that we could recover the inference-based strategy in the first mouse. And we could also decode the counterfactual strategy, which here was the inference-based strategy. So overall, across all the mice, the accuracy of the decoding of a given decision variable was not correlated with its influence on behavior. So to us, it was quite surprising. But to play the devil's advocate, you may have noticed that this particular, for this particular sequence of sensory input that the mouse experience, these two decision variables can be somewhat similar or correlated. So it could be that we can decode one decision variable only by virtue of its correlation with the one that is actually executed by the mouse. So to try to rule out this hypothesis as an explanation, we found a trick. In the sequence of leaks that we have in the session, we can find particular sequences that decorrelate these two different variables. Because, just as a reminder, these different decision variables, they rely on different computation. One requires reset with reward, the other one requires to integrate reward downward. So when we selected these particular sequences and run the decoder all over again, we could still recover these two different decision variables. So it means that this decision variable, they seem to be simultaneously represented in the premotor cortex, and that regardless of the behavior. So is it also true in other brain regions? Well, not really, because it seems like the decoding performance greatly decreased in orbitofrontal cortex and also in the olfactory cortex, at least I mean, compared to the M2. So this seems to suggest that these decision variables, they seem computed in parallel, and specifically in the premotor cortex. But maybe for some of you that know about a reservoir computing framework, this is not so surprising, because it is known that in theory, you can take a neural network with nonlinear response signal that can be trained to decode literally any signal. And it's been proposed that some of this network could be found in the brain, especially in the prefrontal cortex. So it could be that M2 here acts as a reservoir network. And to test this hypothesis, we asked if we could decode from M2 any random signal. So we tested different random signals, especially, so for example, signals that have similar power spectrums of our specific decision variable, or we took our decision variable and shifted them in time. We flipped backward our decision variable, like this example here on the screen. And when we try to decode this random signal, we completely failed. So this is, for example, the neural projection here in black. And this was the case for all the random signals that we've tried. So to sum up, what we found is that there are multiple foraging algorithms that rely on important computation, like here this accumulation of evidence and the reset with reward. That seems to be pre-computed in the premotor cortex, and that regardless of the behavior. So this multiplexing of this relevant nonlinear computation, it could allow for rapidly selecting the appropriate decision variable just by using downstream a simple linear decoder. And we think that it could be an interesting property because it could potentially increase the flexibility when you want to switch between decision strategies when task contingency changes, for example, or even speed up learning if you need to learn a new decision variable based on this relevant computation. So, and with that, I would like to thank the main lab, but especially Zach and Alfonso, who has been instrumental for the development of this project. And I'd like to thank you very much for staying for this last talk. Thank you.